My name is John Pasalis, and welcome to this week's episode of the Move Smartly Show. Today, we're going to be talking about a very old idea and solution to high housing costs that has found renewed interest in recent years. And I'm talking about land value taxes. A land value tax is different from a property tax because property taxes are taxes on the value of the land and the property on that land, whereas land value taxes only tax land. They do not tax any improvement. And the idea is if you're not taxing the improvement, you encourage more housing and more housing construction. Now, economists as far back as Adam Smith and David Ricardo have been big advocates of land value taxes, but the idea really took off actually in the late 1800s with a book titled Progress and Poverty by political economist Henry George. And the big advocates of land value taxes are actually referred to as Georgists after Henry George. Now, land value taxes are a very unique and interesting policy because it has advocates both on the left and right end of the political spectrum. Economists like Milton, Friedman, and Joseph Stiglitz have come out speaking in favor of land value taxes. Now, today, we're going to be speaking with Floyd Marinescu, who's behind a Canadian think tank called Commonwealth Canada that advocates for a land value tax to address some of the challenges in Canada's own housing market. Floyd's going to help us unpack and better understand some of the thinking behind land value taxes and what lessons we can maybe apply to our own housing challenges here in Canada. As always, if you have any questions of your own, you can always email me at askjohn@movesmartly.com. And now on to today's show. Before we kind of get into the weeds of what land value taxes are, how we see them impacting housing, I think it'd be helpful to kick off with maybe getting an idea of what you see are some of the problems today that current policies or tax systems are not addressing, and where you think land value tax could help. So I guess the first question is like, what are the problems you see in our society today? And then we'll chat a little bit about how land value tax might help
Okay, well, we have a lot of problems
that.
as you're a prolific Twitter commentator. But Canada's faced so many crises right now. We have a productivity crisis, we have a housing cost crisis, we have a poverty crisis. A lot of these things intersect with our relationship to housing and to land. Looking at going a bit deeper on housing, you've said a couple times on your Twitter feed that that investors set the floor on pricing, which has the impact of displacing the actual real costs that families might want to pay to live there. We have just rampant speculation we've seen during COVID driving up pricing beyond people's actual need to live. So I think we have a market that is a bit disjointed from the real cost of housing versus for basis people need to live versus what we're doing to it because we're treating homes as a financialized asset, as an investment vehicle. So these are some of the issues, and these also drives poverty. I mean, the number one driver of poverty is rising housing prices. We have a lot of people who are house poor, who have jobs and are still basically living on the edge. And it really shouldn't be that way. Like there's solutions have been known since the beginnings of capitalism, and that's where land value tax comes in. It's been known by hundreds of years of classical economists. If you go on it big, if you go on it small, it can help with some of the incentives that are withholding, causing land to remain underutilized, not getting enough development where it's needed. But it's really it's not a panacea, but it intersects with all these different crises. Also crisis of productivity. A lot of people say we're taxed too high. It really depends on what's being taxed. A lot of people from the who have a background in land value tax believe we should reduce taxes on productivity, like income tax, corporate tax, property taxes, instead have taxes on land because they don't distort the economy. That could go a long way to improving the attractiveness of Canada and its competitiveness on a world stage. So these are some of the problems that intersect with this conversation.
That's super helpful. And I think you touched on an important point where, I mean, I think a lot of people hear about taxes and taxes potentially increasing. No one wants that happening. And I think an important point that you raise is that, in an ideal world, maybe land taxes are higher, but income taxes are lower. And I think that is part of the framework behind kind of the thinking with land value taxes, correct?
That's right. I mean, no one out there is proposing just raising a tax and just funding more government. It's
Mhm.
always a tax shift. The mayor of Detroit is proposing to reduce property taxes and increase a tax specifically on land value, claiming it'll leave 97% of households better off financially. We have our own estimations that I can share later in the show that show that on average most people are better off. And yeah, it's really about finding a system that doesn't punish productivity. If anything, it just makes it a bit harder to have valuable resources be underutilized, and that's frankly better for everyone.
Okay, that's super helpful. Now that we got a bit of an idea of the problems, maybe if you can kind of unpack what a land value tax is and how it's different from property taxes, just so our users can kind of wrap their heads around what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So, a land value tax is a type of property tax. Some critics would say, well, we already pay it, it's baked into the property tax, but not really, because the property tax really penalizes you as you improve your property. If you add extensions, if you put a building somewhere, you suddenly pay more property tax, which is penalizing productivity, versus a land tax is on the unimproved value of land without any developments on it. And it is easy to get those estimations. British Columbia does it. It's a world leader in that regard. You can look up any address in BC and see its land value separate from its property value. So that is pretty easy to do. But psychologically, when you're paying just a property tax, you don't really think about land conservation. You don't really think about those things. It's just a penalizing tax. So it would be much better if we separated those, had the land tax portion listed at a different rate than property tax, and then you could tweak that and see what happens there. It's important to note the impact of land value, I guess, is going back to the problems. Now, we look at the average person's expenses. They think it's housing, they think it's mortgages, but it's actually land. I mean, land is the biggest portion of the value of a home. It's the biggest portion of the value of a mortgage payment, the biggest portion of the value of a rent. It's the value that's attributed to the land. And a very simple way to think of land tax is, if you tax something, it's worth less. So if you tax the value of land, its return over time is less. People will pay less to buy it. The price of land comes down depending on how high the land tax goes. And we could be doing that instead of taxing people's incomes from their jobs in order to bring prices down low, reduce down payments, reduce the cost to acquire land, and eliminate other taxes like developer charges and all those things that we talk about a lot on your show. But yeah, sorry, I went on, but it's a tax on the unimproved value of land. It's kind of in the property tax now, but not really. Another important nuance is that tenants are paying a 100% land tax right now. It's baked into their rent. What do I mean by 100% land tax? This goes all the way back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. The rental value of land is part of the rent someone pays. When you're renting, you're renting the property and the land. So a land tax is thought of as taxing the rent of land. So a landlord's portion of rent they receive, the portion attributable to land, could be taxed in part, maybe 10% of it, 20% of it, 100% of it, if you go all the way with a Georgist solution. So it's a tax on the rental value of land. So tenants pay it now already, 100%. And and that is also one of the reasons why we have a lot of unfairness in the housing market, because everyone's chasing the easy money. It's baking up prices higher, and it comes at the expense of working people, which is why we will always have working poverty. Because as prices go up, jobs will never keep up. We'll always have a large portion of our population living on the edge because of this connection to land value. And sorry, and I should say that there's a view in this movement. This goes back again all the way back to Adam Smith or Henry George is another reformer in the 19th century, who see that land value growth is fundamentally community created. It's created by public investments, by growth in the economy, by changes to zoning. It's created by overall global economic health. Like, no owner can change their land value. They can only change their structure value by improving it. So the general view is that the fairest tax of all would be a tax on land value because nobody earned it, right? Like, you remember during COVID, the headlines that your home makes more money than your job because it appreciated so much. The land appreciated in that year, not the property. And that's fundamentally unearned income. So it's seen that we should untax earned income and instead tax unearned income, which is land value growth. So I'll leave it there.
I mean, that's super helpful. I mean, and it's kind of interesting because I'm in the intro where I kick off this segment. I mentioned that land value taxes is a really interesting tax because it's sort of a tax that the left and the right agree on. You know, you have Milton Friedman saying it's the least worst tax. You have Stiglitz supporting it. So it's one of these interesting taxes that has kind of broad support, but hasn't really moved too much forward. Now, I wanted to unpack a little bit about what you said just to make sure kind of we're clear on some things. Now, you mentioned kind of in the full Georgist approach, we would be taxing like almost 100% of the rent value of the land, right? Is that roughly correct or close to that, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So, and in your example, I mean, just to make this clear for people, I guess the idea when you talk about sort of the landlord and the tenant paying both a kind of a property tax and a land tax effectively, the idea is that suppose, you know, I'm paying $4,000 a month in rent, you know, as a tenant, but my landlord's property, half of that is the value of the property, and half of that is the rent, the land rent, or the value of the land. In the Georgist approach, roughly half of my rent would effectively go towards a land tax, effectively, right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah. If you go the maximalist approach, which
Yeah.
would be the largest approach, would be even Adam Smith's approach, the land portion would be taxed, but everything else would be untaxed, would not be taxed at all.
Hmm.
Um, and by our estimations in British Columbia, because the data is easier to get there, you could actually eliminate provincial income, corporate land transfer fees, vacancy, all these other taxes, eliminate them all, and still have enough to also give all families a $7,300 rebate. And the average family in the average home at the average income would be $5,800 a head per year after this tax shift. So it seems like it's a high amount to pay, but it can come off other taxes elsewhere.
So that's interesting. Now, I mean, it's so I have a couple of questions, I guess. One is in this idea of sort of the tenant paying both a land tax and a property tax and increasing land taxes for landlords. How does that help rental affordability for me as a tenant? Like, so the landlord pays more in taxes, you know, they're paying a higher land tax. Their net rent or net income is lower, but how does that benefit renters?
Right. So first of all, I love that we jumped into the maximalist solution.
Well, okay, okay.
So, but just to
Sure.
clarify, like I just want to reframe that a very small land tax shift could
Mhm.
already help with some of the incentives. And I'll get to your question because it's a
Sure.
very good question. Like a 0.2% land value tax in Ontario could eliminate the need for any developer charges. It raise the same amount of fees. Even developers have been asking for that for a while. A very small 0.2%. In Australia, in the city of Victoria, they have a small land transfer tax, and they changed some of the exemptions so it applies. Sorry, land value tax, so it applies to more people. And they saw an exodus, like almost 10% of second and third property owners sold their properties, and we had more first-time home buyers buying those properties. So let's get back to your question now.
Yeah.
Again, if you're lowering someone's income tax or even giving them a rebate, like the way we have the carbon rebate, for instance, could have a land rebate, tenants are ahead because they're being charged less for their job. And meanwhile, they're still paying the same amount on the outflow. They're still paying the same rent because the rents won't go up and down with the land transfer tax, but they're benefiting because that money is actually going to fund our life, it's going to fund our society, as opposed to going to the landlord's pocket. While reducing their income tax or even getting a rebate, depends on how it's done. So, what you do with the land transfer value tax is a key point, right? It's not just about raising a tax. If you want to encourage building, you reduce property taxes dollar for dollar with it. If you want to increase productivity, we can reduce taxes on incomes, on corporate and property, and personal incomes. If we want to compensate people that are being screwed by the current system, we can include rebates, like a tax rebate from it. Because as you've probably seen, the average net worth of renters is like $11,000. The average net worth of homeowners is almost $400,000.
Mhm.
That's kind of unfair, given that land value growth is not created by the homeowner.
Mhm.
So having some rebates there is a way to share in this land value growth. But so to get to your question, it'll help tenants directly because they'll spend less money, so that they'll have more money in their pocket. And also, it should induce more supply, and that gets into a whole different discussion about how a land value tax reduces speculation, helps bring underutilized land to market. It should induce more supply being created, which overall should reduce rents in the long term.